Part 2, Chapter 1, Economics and the Doctrine of Man. The word totalitarianism is a modern word for an ancient fact, for a condition virtually universal in antiquity and persistent throughout history. In the ancient world, ultimate power and authority were held to be immanent in the world of man, so that the arena of ultimate decision was always human history. The gods themselves were deified men who, as spirits, still were essentially concerned with the welfare of their earthly state. Thus, several Greek cities claimed to be the site of Zeus's death and grave, and Zeus, as a hero king who was now a deified spirit, was oriented to time and politics. The gods themselves were subject to time and fate, so that their destinies were historically governed. Hence their intense interest in history and supremely in politics. The gods were the gods of an historical state, city, or empire. Zeus was the god of the Greeks, Baalim were the gods of the Canaanites, Ra of the Egyptians, Dagon of the Philistines, and so on. A stateless god was held to be an impossibility, and the claims of Israel that its God claimed lordship over all nations, indeed all creation, was not believed. He was the God of Israel. The gods could be, like their state, imperialistic. Like their states, they could be conquered and incorporated into the conquering state. The gods were then included in the pantheon of gods as lesser and subject deities, as vassal powers. If the gods could not be stateless, much less was it possible for a man to be stateless. The environment and the life of man was held to be the state. Stateless man was a contradiction. Freedom meant total subservience to the state. What George Orwell depicts in 1984 was, to a large degree, barring the technological refinements, normative in antiquity. Because of this, religion in antiquity was a department of state, whose function was to provide social cement to hold the state firmly together. Religion, then, as it again shows signs of becoming today, was civil religion, and the very word liturgy means simply, in its original Greek, public work. Religion was essentially civil more than personal. It was the state's department of public works designed to bind the state more firmly to the sovereign's will. Religion, thus, as an independent fact, did not exist outside of Israel. The same was true of everything else. There was, for example, no independent economic sphere, only the political control of economics. We are familiar with the fact that the word economics in Greek meant household management, but we are less familiar with the fact that the house was the state and its economic life, and that of every citizen and home was totally subject to status management. A reading of Plutarch's Lives makes clear that citizens were simply an economic resource to be used by the state. In such a social order, people were more ready to be used, whether militarily or economically, because life apart from the state was to them the ultimate evil, and life in the state man's only hope. The exception to this totalitarianism was ancient Israel, and after the division into two separate sides, Judea in particular, the office of priest was clearly separated from that of the monarch, and the prophet was the spokesman for God in applying the standard of God's law to a sinful social order. With the early church and its world mission, this faith became a threat to the existing world orders. The result was the persecution everywhere of the church as an enemy state and a rival empire. With respect to Rome, Francis Legge pointed out, quote, "The officials of the Roman Empire in time of persecution sought to force the Christians to sacrifice not only to heathen gods, but to the genius of the emperor and the fortune of the city of Rome. And at all times the Christians' refusal was looked upon not as a religious, but as a political offence. Whatever rivalry the Christian Church had to face in its infancy, it had none to fear from the deities of Olympus." End quote. By placing ultimacy in the triune God, biblical faith removed it from the state. Neither the unity Particularity or the priority of things came from or was to be defined by the state. Their source was the ontological trinity, which embodied the equal ultimacy of the one and the many. The result was warfare between Christ and the Caesars and the destruction of the monolithic order of antiquity. In terms of biblical law, the state is a very limited institution, hardly a state in a modern sense. Its taxing power is limited to a head or poll tax, which is the same for all males 20 years of age and older. No other tax is legitimate. Basic to military defence is a citizen's army, with only a limited professional soldier possible in so limited a state. It is not surprising, therefore, that while in Byzantium the Greek tradition survived enough to create a strong state, in the West the state collapsed, not only militarily but also intellectually. The organisation of life was so radically altered that the population of Rome at one point was as low as 500, and urban life everywhere decayed. In a very real sense, civil government and economics became household management. The regrowth of urban life was largely made possible by Jewish merchants applying biblical law to the management of trading centres, which developed into cities. Europe gave promise of developing the integrity and freedom of the various spheres: economics, education, politics, religion, etc. This development was frustrated first by Neoplatonism and second by the revival of Aristotle's philosophy, and the result was the revival of the ancient totalitarian dream of a unitary order. Church and state were the main contenders for this exclusive role, with the university also asserting for a time a like claim. Once again, the umbrella view of society prevailed, with church and state each claiming to be that umbrella under whose protection all men and institutions must reside. With the Renaissance in particular, statist power and tyranny became once again prevalent. The Christian view of man as a sinner and a creature was replaced by the new view of man as ultimate, autonomous, and divine. Man now claimed priority, and the result was the destruction of the very limited freedom which had developed. If ultimate power resides in eternity, and the universe is its creation, there is then no competition, no war of the gods between God and man. Man's offence, then, is sin. While sin is an offence against the sovereign and eternal God, it is not a threat to him. If ultimate power is transferred to history, then there is competition for ultimacy, a, quote, war of the gods, end quote, and the freedom of man and of any sphere of thought or activity is a threat to all claimants to power. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation for a time abated and altered the destruction of the integrity of spheres of thought and activity. Calvinism in particular began the development of concepts which led to a stress on the freedom of each sphere under God. Church, state, schools, economics, the sciences, the family, etc., are each independent and interdependent spheres directly under God, each with an obligation to serve God, and each without authority to rule over the other spheres. The laws of economics were thus not derived from the ruler, but from God. Accordingly, usury was not to be viewed in Greek terms, but in biblical terms, which meant that while charity had to be charity, and loans made in that spirit interest-free, all other interest was legitimate. The significance of this conclusion was great. Economics was freed from Hellenic presuppositions and governed rather by God's law, not by man. The result was the progressive emancipation of economics from the state and its control. As a part of this transfer of economics from man's government, that is, the state, to God's government, that is, his law as revealed in Scripture, books began to appear to guide man in his economic activity. Such titles as the Christian Navigator, Merchant, Apprentice, Husbandman, etc. began to abound. The Bible became a handbook for business to an extent we cannot appreciate today, and the book of Proverbs in particular was widely used, memorized and cited by merchants as a guide to their actions. We have echoes of this reliance on proverbs in Benjamin Franklin's sayings of Poor Richard. The Enlightenment, however, was altering the philosophical framework of Western man, and from Christianity to deism, from revealed law to natural law. Government still existed beyond man, but it was essentially in nature rather than in God. Whereas previously Christianity had declared nature to be fallen and hence not normative, deism now affirmed nature to be normative and the source of law. The rule of providence now became the rule of natural law and laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is indeed a secularized version of the doctrine of providence. The kind of economic thought developed a few centuries earlier by Rushdoony now began to command the minds of men. Nature replaced God to a considerable extent as the source of all things and as the governing power. In Scotland, where older Calvinism was still strong, God and nature were somehow tied together so that the idea of the invisible hand was posited. The invisible hand is a theological concept. Nature was Newtonian and mechanical. In any case, the result was a rapid development of economic thought and activity. Economics was no longer the household management of a ruler governing his realm, but the natural outworkings of a law order basic to the nature of things. Freedom would in time produce the desired results and correct all evils. The spheres were thus released from the umbrella of the state and of the church. Whereas previously historical developments meant the growth of statist power and order, or of ecclesiastical power and order, it now meant the growth of economic, scientific, educational, agricultural, and other activities and spheres. In fact, progress came to mean precisely growth in these areas. The return of antiquity and its unitary concept of life in the state came with Hegel and Darwin. For Hegel, reason, nature, mind, and spirit had their incarnation in the state, and progress meant not the freedom of the spheres and growth therein, but the comprehension of every area of life and thought in the state. Evolution for Hegel meant the development of the modern state. The foundations of such an approach had been laid by Kant. Hegel developed them, and modern socialism received its philosophical framework. Man was no longer God's creature, but a product of cultural evolution, and his future evolution best assured by the state and its power. It was Charles Darwin, as Marx and Engels rightly saw, who gave socialism a measure of historical, quote-unquote, inevitability. Darwin's work undercut the foundations of classical economics. First, nature with Darwin ceased to be the arena or the glove of the invisible hand. Instead, nature was depicted as mindless brute factuality, and man and the universe a product of chance development. Second, by this, Darwin eliminated not only mind from nature, but law as well. Evolution was seen not as a product of law, but of chance variations. The universe has no inherent law, and the probability concept replaced the idea of natural law. Now, the probability concept is itself under attack as too theological because it posits some kind of inherent mind and order. The universe of Darwin is mindless and lawless. This is the a priori assumption of evolutionary thought in the main. Third, this meant that there was now no basis for classical economics. Nature has no inherent law, so that the free market can assure society of nothing other than the brutal survival of the fittest. Not even the fittest can be defined as other than the survivors. As Marx and Engels saw clearly, God had been abolished and denied earlier, and now nature was reduced to a mindless brute factuality. Only one source of law remained, the state. Earlier, Max Stirner had foreseen this outcome in Hegel's theory of cultural evolution, and he had set forth as the sole source of law, individual anarchistic man, totally lawless and recognizing no law other than his own will. Marx recognized the logical force of Stirner's thought. Without God and without natural law, only anarchistic man remains, Sadean man, and hence his long and violent attack on Stirner. Truth, Marx recognized, or logic, was on Stirner's side. Stirner's principle, however, dissolved the state and destroyed socialism. On pragmatic and religious grounds, that is, as an article of faith, Marx asserted the necessity for socialism. There had to be state organization to remake man, to provide law until law became inherent in man's being. The impact of Darwin can be seen in its logic in the life of John Stuart Mill. Mill moved from classical economics to socialism because for him the law basis of classical economics was gone. In the universe of Darwin, the only possible source of law is man alone, or man organized as the state. Freud's doctrine of man further complicated the situation. How could Freudian man, organized or unorganized, be the source of law when man is, in the depths of his being, ruled by the id, the pleasure principle? The ego for Freud is the reality principle, but also the will to death is incorporated in the ego because the ego restrains the id, the will to live, by its recognition of the limits reality places upon our ability to realize the pleasure principle. Freud's man is irrational and lawless, and is essentially governed by a will to death. The behaviorist answer to this culminates in B.F. Skinner, whose research is well funded by federal grants. The vast majority of men are beyond freedom and dignity. Only a small elite miraculously rises above the inherent bondage of man. We are not told how, because this is an article of faith, that a few men are exceptions. This elite must totally govern, control, and condition all other men for their welfare and for society's survival. The survival of man requires that this elite become the law, holding ultimate power and authority. In such a perspective, economics again becomes the household management of a ruling class rather than an independent law sphere. The future of man and his economic activity is thus one of enslavement to an elite group of planners. As a teacher once affirmed vehemently to me, in the modern world, freedom is obsolete because it does not permit the controls which are basic to scientific experimentation. Society is increasingly viewed in Marxist and non-Marxist countries as an area of social science, that is, of scientific planning and control. Here we have the abandonment of law for social experimentation. Instead of a planned society, that is, one determined by an established plan, logic, purpose, or reason, we now have a planning society, one in which there is no pre-established plan or logic, but only endless experimentation. For Stalin, thus, as for all social experimenters, there were no evil acts in the mass liquidations, slave labour camps, and purges, but only experiments. Even successful experiments are scientifically valid because they determine what can or cannot be done at the moment. The modern doctrine of man has carried the pagan view to its logical conclusions. Not surprisingly, economics as a law sphere is held in disrespect. What we have in its place is politics, or the political usurpation of economics. Only as ultimacy is removed from man and the state and restored to the God of Scripture can we again free man and the spheres of life from totalitarianism. We are today at the logical conclusion of humanism and the age of the state. The decaying world order will not be renewed and reconstructed until man again acknowledges the ultimacy and sovereignty of the triune God.